Hey everyone! I got a magic pot which lets me know which monster is gonna show up in the new Ultraman episode. However, there is a slight margin of error though. The last time I tried it, they gave me an entirely different monster from an entirely different franchise. Looks like it's not ready yet for this week's one. Maybe a can of Raid will help. The Monster of the Week formula. Ultraman fans, like myself, are probably very familiar with this format. The Monster of the Week format is exactly what it says. A new monster or enemy shows up every week. In other words, every new episode features a new threat. Sounds exciting, right? Some examples of shows with this format are The X-Files, Kolchak the Night Stalker, Digimon Ghost Game, a majority of tokusatsu franchises, including, of course, Ultraman, which is probably one of the shows where the term even came from. This format sounds like a heckin' good deal, right? We get new monsters, new characters, new plots, and not just one single long narrative that won't even get completed in the next episode. I mean, we wouldn't have gotten Savenger otherwise. Not everyone feels the same way, of course. From what I've seen nowadays, Monster of the Week has somewhat become of a negative among audiences. I'll try to summarize what I've seen are people's gripes with the format. Firstly, people think they're repetitive. I see this complaint a lot in shows like JoJo's and Digimon and sometimes even Kamen Rider. Basically, the formula would involve an enemy showing up, heroes minding their own business, what the enemy is doing crosses paths with the heroes defeat the enemy never comes back and status quo is then restored. Now that is heavily watering it down, but these story beats can get pretty boring to sit through every episode, and more importantly, not rewarding as a weekly viewer because you know what's going to happen isn't going to affect the show all that much. Secondly, there's the complaint that Monster of the Week episodes have filler to the main plot, and that people would much prefer for the main story to advance. This is kind of understandable, I get where they're coming from, but we'll get back to this in a bit for a justification. And finally, there's the issue that the format restrains the episode's plot to fully flesh out, and the episodic format can sometimes butcher how a resolution plays out, which I actually kind of agree with sometimes. Now, these are all valid complaints about the format, but as an Ultraman fan, I want to make an argument that the Monster of the Week format should not be seen as a bad thing, and I will use the Ultra series to illustrate why. While I don't deny that the Monster of the Week shows tend to have a formulaic approach to the structure of the episodes, no show is just going to barf out the plot beats exactly like that. Most of the time, the execution can be wildly different. Sometimes, even the titular Monster of the Week can be a returning villain back for revenge or something. Let's take an episode from Ultraman 1966 for example. Episode 23, My Home is Earth. The Science Patrol, doing Science Patrol things, check. Monster makes a move, check. Monster attacks and Science Patrol intervenes, check. Ultraman appears and defeats the monster, check. No plot advancements whatsoever, check. See, standard Monster of the Week format. So how did it become one of the most iconic stories in the whole franchise? Maybe because they had a French guy. Maybe that's why. My Home is Earth features the kaiju Jamila, who was an astronaut mutated in space and came back in anger towards humanity that had abandoned him. The episode tackles the issues of mercy killing, technological advancements, and the cost of development towards humanity, using the character Ide as the audience's lens into the conflict. Even the victory over Jamila is far from triumphant, and of course, Akio Jisoji's beautiful directing lent to some amazing shots for the episode. So this is where I'd argue that the Monster of the Week formula is the best at. It can inherently tell all kinds of stories within the world and through the characters. A good chunk of Ultraman series is done in this format. Heck, it all started from the anthological Ultra Q back in 1966, and even that was inspired by the Twilight Zone. Let's now take Ultraman Tiga for example. For one episode, you can have a light-hearted but moving story about two polar opposite red and blue aliens, where one of them befriends an old lady, while another episode can be a tragic story about a mutated pet bird and its connection to its owner. Maybe these episodes have nothing to do with the main plot, that all of these are filler to get to the main meat, but I'd argue that this is the plot, this is the story. Some shows are just designed to tell an anthology of stories that are lived through by the main cast. Every episode having its own plot, tone, and set pieces contributes heavily to how I personally can remember the monsters that show up, and makes us as the viewer really enjoy the ride with the recurring cast. In a way, it's like a slice of life. Some of the most remembered episodes in the franchise have nothing to do with the main plot sometimes. Alien Boy from Ultraman Dyna, the Ambassador from Non-Malt from Ultra 7, Who Am I from Ultraman Max, all have varying tones and genres and give a lot of flavor to their own series. Now, that isn't to say that Monster of the Week shows are episodic and allergic to changing the status quo. I might be though. Despite what you perceive as the term episodic, there is a sense of progression in the series. Ultraman Taro, the one that's probably seen as the most childish series by many, and by extension the most episodic. I recently rewatched Taro, and its continuity between episodes is actually done majorly well. Just from the first 4 episodes, you can get the progression between Kotaro's relationship with Kenichi, his boxing, Mother of Ultra's appearance to help Taro. It's all really solid. It's not in your face, you can still watch it without knowing the events of what happened in the previous episodes, but it's there when you pay attention. The degree of continuity importance varies from series to series though. For instance, Ultraman Gaia and Ultraman Mebius both have distinct story arc structure for the season, which usually culminates in a status quo changing event. The Ultraman Agul showdown arc for Gaia, which resulted in Ultraman Agul disappearing for a bit and Ultraman Gaia getting a power-up, and the Flame of Promise 2-parter in Ultraman Mebius, which resulted in Guys knowing Ultraman Mebius' identity, thus both of which had lasting consequences. However, within those arcs, there are still self-contained stories which slowly build up to their respective climaxes. A common worry and concern with some of these series is that the shows won't have enough time to wrap things up well, especially for shows that set up a lot of plot threads and themes. This wasn't a problem for shows like Ultraman, Return of Ultraman, and Ultraman Ace. Their finales were basically one episode offs and ended with the Ultra just leaving. The shows didn't have many plot lines to tie up to begin with, and even Ultraman Ace, with its recurring enemy Yapul, already kind of concluded itself a long time ago, and the running theme was continued in the next series Ultraman Taro. There started to be a lot more plot threads in series starting from Ultraman Tiga, with its overarching plot of an impending darkness. With Ultraman Tiga, we see that the show doesn't have to specifically enter a final arc to start wrapping things up. On paper, its finale is just 2 parts if you consider the coming of Katanozoa, the final enemy, to be where its end is. But it had subtly foreshadowed and addressed the ancient past plot lines a lot earlier in episodes like the Evil Tiga episode and the Gijera episode. Heck, just 4 episodes before the finale, we had a light-hearted episode tributing the original Ultraman. Ultra 7's acclaimed finale was also just 2 episodes long, and Ultraman Dyna also just took 3 episodes to wrap the entire series up, with some really well done tonal shifts, and right before that they were still f***ing around with Damoshite X. All 3 of the mentioned finales, Tiga's, 7's, and Dyna's, are considered some of the best endings in the franchise, at least from what I've seen. My point is that historical evidence shows that even with few episodes, it is possible to have a great conclusion to a series that addresses the plot lines established. So personally, I wouldn't worry about a show not having time to flesh out its ending. Of course, it comes down to how it's going to be written and how you structure the ending. And not all Ultraman series are episodic, of course. New generations tend to have a solid overarching plotline, while still dealing with individual monsters every week. Only this time, most of the monsters that appear every week come from the enemy's summoning, like Celebro or Kei Fukuide or the Ancient Giants, and the plot usually tries to further the main story, if even a little bit. And then we have Ultraman Nexus, probably the most serialized main Ultra show, which doesn't really follow the standard Ultra episode format. Speaking of Monster of the Week in Ultraman, the fact that the format features a new monster every week is basically advertised in the series itself. They add a little note in the end of the intro to the episode featuring the names of the monsters, like featuring the assassin Choju Baraba, for instance. Later in the Heisei era, they added these on the episode title cards instead. Later ones, starting from Mebius I believe, started even showing silhouettes of the monsters as well. It's a really cute touch. At the end of the day, there's nothing inherently wrong with the Monster of the Week format. It tends to get a bad rap because it seems like audiences nowadays prefer sprawling overarching epic plots over the course of 50 episodes. This positive association may come from a survivorship bias, as most acclaimed shows tend to have this format in play, but it's not the deciding factor whether a show will be fantastic or not. Even a plot-heavy show can get bogged down by a horrible ending, a boring middle plot, or simply an uninteresting premise. That said, if there's no strong hook to pull you in, there's not a lot of motivation or reward to keep going to watch these episodes. For me and many others, seeing Ultraman eventually show up and wreck things up is the motivation to watch, even if we might not really care for the episode's premise. And even better, the main human cast would be a reason to continue watching, but most of the time, they manage to tell some really good stories that get you hooked even if you don't actually initially care at first. Personally, I think this is what makes Ultraman a special show for me. I'd love to hear what you guys think of this format. So I conclude that having consistent quality across everything, writing, the characters, the plot, the production values, is the key to not making a bad show. Ah, looks like the magic pot's ready. So this week's monster is... unfinished laundry?